Well, it's a joy to be with you. I've been here before, not to the school campus, but I was at one of your annual meetings here about 20 years ago, and someone reminded me, two or three people have reminded me about that today, about how I kind of came with a little trepidation, bunch of fighting fundamental King James people back in those days especially, and then I saw a guy out there with a pink tie on, and I said, well, these guys they're not that gritty, so I can do it. Well, you know, although we come through different paths of this Baptist journey, here tonight, you and I share some real common roots. 100 years ago this year, my father knelt at the altar of the First Baptist Church in Fort Worth after one of Dr. Norris's sermons and came to Christ. My great uncle, Harry Keaton, who was saved at the church downtown in one of those sensational things Norris did to try to attract crowds, became his chairman of deacons for many, many years and one of his staunch supporters. In fact, at family reunions, his name was Harry Keaton. At family reunions, we often talked about, and I heard the stories as a little child, of how Dr. Norris would take those offerings in a wash tub on Sunday nights, and back in the 20s, early 30s, and he would start out by saying, who's going to give $50? Now, that was a lot of money back in those days. And my great uncle, Harry Keaton, he'd raise his hand, say, I will. He'd write a check out and come down, put it in the wash tub. Then who's going to give $40? By the time he got down to $1 and whatever, all 5,000 people in attendance that night had come and put their money in that wash tub to do that. And then every Monday morning, Keaton would go by Dr. Norris' office and he'd give him his check back, because he just used him to bait the offering when they did that. Such was some of those things. Well, we're here to celebrate 75 years of what Mr. Vic called a movement, and surely it has been that. A movement that was born like birth. It was born in pain. And weeping endured for a night, but joy came in the morning here in this property. You know, the split between Beecham Vic and Dr. Norris, I did a PhD dissertation on Norris and some things, so I've read thousands of his letters, everything that's in every archive anywhere. So many of them that went back and forth to him between he and Mr. Vic in 49 and 50 were something to read. But that split didn't really come in May of 1950. It had been brewing for a while. It was like a boil that had been festering along the way. And, you know, Norris had no better friend, no more faithful, loyal servant leader than Beecham Vic for all those years at Temple Baptist Church. In fact, Vic had served as a youth minister in 1929 down in Fort Worth with Norris. He looked upon as a son to Norris so many ways. And Norris wrote him a letter. There was a chairman of deacons there at Temple Baptist named Ralph Pugh. Some of you may remember that name. I guess it was the first time anybody had ever stood up to Dr. Norris, and Pugh did. And so Norris wrote Vic a letter up at Temple and said, you can tell Temple Baptist Church to go to hell. And, well, a few weeks later, Temple Baptist Church told Norris to go to hell. And the deacons voted 25-0 to fire him, and the church voted 3,000-7 to fire him. And, you know, we hear a lot about what all Norris did at Temple Baptist Church, but Temple's greatest days were in the aftermath of Norris's firing, when Vic led it to reach more people than they had ever reached before in that time. Dr. John Rawlings has been mentioned tonight. I was a dear friend of the Rawlings family, Herb and Harold are great friends of mine, and I knew Dr. John, talked to him just days before he died. And he told me that he thinks Norris had a series of strokes back there that made him not the same person that he was in certain other things. But you know what I've discovered in his life, to be honest with you? There are two things. You know, I want to finish well. I hope you do. And in the end, much, if not most, of everything Frank Norris fought flourished. BBFI, BBC, SBC, First Baptist Dallas, Southwestern Seminary. When you really look at it, most of everything that he fought flourished in the aftermath of his death. And much of what he stood for diminished. And so there's lots of lessons to be learned along the way of this life. So here we are at this time. You know, incidentally, Homer Ritchie, do anybody remember the name Homer Ritchie? Okay, I'm sure many of you do. Some of you don't. Homer Ritchie was a student at Bible Baptist Seminary in Fort Worth when Vic and his band of brothers split from Norris. He was a student there. And as soon as Norris died, 2 years later, they called 25-year-old Homer Ritchie to be pastor and successor to Norris there at First Baptist. And Homer was a friend of mine. He's in heaven today. Homer told me that during that time, after they met, somebody mentioned the Texas Hotel. I don't know if you know what happened, the Texas Hotel. That's where Vic and your founders went over there and met when Norris had changed the bylaws and done all the funny stuff he was doing there in his autocratic way, and where they decided to leave. And Ritchie told me that he and some of the students went to lunch at a little restaurant at 4th Street, right across the street from the church over there. And he said they had booths in this restaurant that had little folding doors on them. And he said he and his buddies sat down in a booth, and he said all of a sudden they heard two men talking in the booth next to them, and the voices were unmistakable. It was Frank Norris and G.B. Vick. And Ritchie said that Norris, in a tone that was so conciliatory, as though he had his hat in his hand, was begging Vick not to leave, asking him to forgive him, pleading with him not to do it. And Ritchie told me that he remembered Vic saying, "There's too much water that's passed under the bridge, and our decision has already been made." And so Beecham Vic and that band of brothers came here to Springfield, and their influence has been immense. During a snapshot of time, some of you younger folks may not know that, during a snapshot of time, most of the largest churches in America were pastored by young men that were trained right here on this property at Bible Baptist College in those days. And I could name many of them. One of them's already been mentioned tonight, Jerry Falwell, who was here. In fact, when I was pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas, John Rawlings' boy, Herb, was a member of the church. He sang in the choir. And Herb and I were buddies. And Herb's roommate here, his first year at BBC, was Jerry Falwell. And Herb said one Saturday, Jerry said to him one Saturday morning, he said, "Let's get in my car and let's go down and hear W.A. Crystal in Dallas preach tomorrow." And so Herb said, Jerry and I got in the car and we drove to Dallas, and we got down to Dallas and ate dinner someplace. And then when darkness came, Jerry said, "Come on, let's go down to church. Let's go downtown and see the church before we go tomorrow." And said we went downtown and we got out of everything was dark. We said we got out of the car, and Jerry and Herb said we started walking around the church, and Jerry started checking every window in the church until he found one that was unlocked. And he said he climbed in the window. He said, "Come on, Herb, follow me." Herb said, I went in the window, and he said we found our way into the auditorium, and Jerry got in the auditorium. He said, "Herb, sit down on the front row." And Jerry got up in Crystal's pulpit. Dr. Crystal was pastor in those days. And Jerry preached a sermon there in the darkness that Saturday night. The next morning, they came and heard Dr. Crystal and drove back to Springfield. So Monday morning in chapel, They had testimonies everywhere, and Herb said people were getting up, giving testimonies where they'd preached the Sunday before and how many were saved, et cetera, as they did. He said all of a sudden, across the room, Jerry was sitting on the other side of the auditorium, he stood up. He said, I preached this weekend in the pulpit of the great First Baptist Church in Dallas. And man, all the students' eyes got that big. And from then on, they thought Jerry Falwell was really something. So you've got quite a history with so many characters around here, that's for sure. And the lives of thousands of your graduates like Jerry and thousands of others have gone out from this place and touched the lives of millions of people around the world. When I was driving to the airport in Dallas this morning, I just noticed, I was on the freeway and I was looking through the rearview mirror, seeing what was behind me, going, that's a pretty good thing to do from time to time. And so that's what this week I really guess is about, just taking a glance. Not enough people do that. A lot of people forget their roots. And it's good from time to time to just look in the rearview mirror and see what's going on. When I've been thinking about this night, I thought, what is it that we could really take from these founders of this place? So I see these two. I've listened to a lot of tapes of Mr. Vic, and I've read a bunch of stuff in the last couple of months thinking about this night. And I've determined there are three things about these fellows that really we should emulate today. First of all, they were VIPs. They were really VIPs. Now, I don't mean very important people. Some of you think VIP means very important person. It doesn't. It means very influential person. It means very influential people. And influence is what I want to talk about. Influence, we get influence from Latin. It comes from two words in Latin, in and flow. And it's the picture of a big river that's flowing crystal clear and mighty and vibrant, and it's flowing with this great current. And into that river come these little tributaries and creeks and streams, and they find their way into that river, and they're what? They're carried away in its flow. That's what influence is. That we live our lives in such a vibrant manner that people come in contact with us and are carried away in our flow. I have a text tonight that I want to base this on, and it's from the second letter to the Corinthians in the 10th chapter and the 13th verse. For some of you King James only folks, I brought my King James Bible tonight. And it says, we will not boast of things without our measure, but according to the measure of the gift of the rule which God hath distributed to us. Now, if those Greeks, when those Greeks in Corinth were reading this second letter, and they came to the 13th verse of 2 Corinthians chapter 10, they would have been shocked. They would have known exactly what the writer was talking about, Paul in his letter. It says that each of us has been assigned an area, a lane, an area of influence. That Greek word we translate there, that measure or area of influence, is the same word that they would have known in those Grecian games. Lane is what it is. It's a lane. Each of us have been assigned a lane in which to run this life of ministry and this Christian life. And they knew those Grecian games, those relay races. We see the track meets. The tracks are laid out with those lanes. And when you run in a relay race and you get out of your lane, what happens? You're disqualified. You're assigned a lane in which to run, and you have to run that race in your lane that has been assigned to you. And that is exactly what Paul is saying to us when he says that God has assigned an area of influence for each one of us. And the lesson tonight is this: somewhere there's something for you to do that nobody else can do like you can do. Somewhere there's somebody to reach for Christ that no one else can reach for Christ quite like you can, because God has assigned this lane for you to run in, this area of influence. Somewhere there's some influence you can have on someone that no one else can have. That's why nobody has a DNA like yours, because you're indescribably valuable to God. And He has assigned this area of influence in which to run this race. So that's what happens when men like your founders come to a place like this and begin to influence the world. 3 characteristics about them I've kind of jotted down. First of all, they knew where they were going. You know what? I'm not influenced by people that don't know where they're going. But you find somebody and they know where they're going, they're people of influence. They knew where they were going. They knew who they were. They didn't come up here and try to be J. Frank Norris. They knew who they were. And they knew why they were here. They were moved and motivated by a godly and inner purpose. Knowing where you are and who you are and why you are is what leads you to be people of influence. So that's why I say they were VIPs, not very important people. You know what? You look in life, people that think they're important, we're not influenced by those kind of people. But you show me somebody that influences my life, somebody that has had an impact on me. They're very influential people. So let's just know what can we look in the rearview mirror and learn from your founders and learn from this thing tonight about these men that came here and did what they did and have passed the baton on now to you. First of all, they were people, VIPs. They were very influential people. They were people of vision. They were people of vision. That's what the V is for. It's for vision. People that influence other people know where they're going. Now, you know what happens when God gives you a vision? When you have a vision, when you know where you're going, it brings definition to what you're doing. That's what happened when they got here. It had already defined their task before they ever got here. They knew what it was. It brought definition. It brought direction. They didn't get to the intersection, wring their hands, and wonder which way they were going to turn at the intersection, because they had a vision of what God wanted them to do. And it brought not only definition of what they were doing, it brought direction. It brought a dynamic to what they were doing. There was a dynamic in this place that was amazing, fueled by the power of the Holy Spirit. And it brought a dependence. It has to be so big that you're so dependent upon. I was looking at that trail, what it was called, trail what? Trailhead. Where are you, Trailhead? Oh, you're way back there. Did you see the vision he had? Put a church where everybody in the world can walk to it, something like that. That's a vision. We ought to have a vision of what God wants us to do that's so big that unless He comes through, we're sunk. And so these were people of vision. They knew where they were going. What did the wisest man who ever lived, Solomon, say? In Proverbs 29:18, he said, where there's no vision, the people what? Perish. That Hebrew word means they go back. Same words used to the children of Israel. It said that we want to go back to Egypt. It's also used in the Old Testament of a man that was unkept with matted hair. Where there's no vision, where there's no spirit of conquest, we want to go back. You know, I preached the commencement at Liberty University a couple of years ago. Jerry Falwell and I were very, very close friends. I love Jerry. In fact, during my days of pastoral ministry, many of my best friends were BBFI, BBC people. And Jerry was a very close friend of mine. And I went back to preach commencement there a couple of years ago. And I hadn't been back on that campus since Jerry died 18 years ago, 2007. And I couldn't believe what had happened to that campus. There were 40,000 people in the football stadium for commencement. They had dorms there then that looked like Four Seasons hotels. They had libraries, robotic. The kids get on their apps, and by the time they get there, the robot's gone and got the book and brought it to them. And I was walking across the campus, and I thought to myself, man, I wish Jerry could see this now. And the president kind of hinted about this a while ago. And you know what? I decided he did see it, and that's why it was there. When Liberty University was meeting in the 3 or 4 education rooms in his education building at Thomas Road Baptist Church, he was going all over the country telling people it was going to be what Brigham Young was to Mormons and Catholics, Notre Dame was to Catholics, to evangelical Baptists. Vision is vital in what we do. And you know how it came with Beecham Big and those folks that came with him. It's just like the birth of a baby. You say, I want to get a vision for my church. I want a new vision for where I am. How do you get a vision? Exactly like a birth of a baby. Most of us here today are parents. You get that vision exactly like you got your child. You say, how? Well, the first stage is conception, where the seed of a man and the egg of a woman come together in conception, and in that tiny, unseen piece of protoplasm are all the intricacies of a nervous system, a respiratory system, a digestive system, a circulatory system, all there. Conception, that's how life begins. That's how visions begin. When some man, some woman alone with God gets a vision of what God wants them to be or do. And God plants that vision, that seed of where he wants to take you. He plants it in your heart. And then what's the next stage? Gestation. I remember when our first child was going to be born, Susie, my wife, was pregnant. We didn't tell anybody for a while. Then after a few months, people started noticing something was growing in her. Gestation. That's the second stage in growth. That's such an important stage in a vision. You know why a lot of people's visions never get anywhere and are stillborn? Because they don't gestate them. You get a vision from God of what he wants you to do, conceived in your heart. Then what do you do? You gestate it. You pray about it. You dream about it. You think about it. You live with it. You pray over it. You meditate on it. You live with it. You don't tell people about it. You don't go share what it is. You let it grow inside of you. And you know what will happen in your church? It won't be long till people will see something's growing in the pastor. Something is happening here. Then comes the third stage, birth. And the baby's born, we hand out the cigar. Well, you don't do that here at BBC. You don't hand out cigars. But the baby's born and we celebrate because birth has come. And that's the way it is with the vision. You get it conceived with God. You gestate it in your heart. Then there comes a time you let it out and you tell. Then comes the next stage. One of the most beautiful words in the English language. Adoption. That's when somebody who didn't conceive or gestate or birth that child takes it as their very own. By all legal rights, it has their name. And they've adopted it. That's the miracle of a vision God gives us in ministry. When people adopt the vision that God has given us. And a lot of people don't get people to adopt visions because they don't understand getting people to adopt your vision is just as easy as ABC. A, is it achievable? Is it achievable? You know, don't go out there and lay out a vision with people that it has no possibility of ever being achieved. Is it B, believable? Can you get people to believe this is going to happen? Is it achievable? Is it believable? C, is it conceivable? Can you get people to conceive? Yes, I can be a part of this. I believe it. It's achievable. And they buy into it and they adopt it. And then comes the next stage, growth. You saw it here. And when a child is growing, you know what happens? It costs you a lot. They grow out of their jeans. They grow out of tennis shoes. They got fees for this. They got fees for that. They want to go here. They want to go there. It costs time. It costs money. It costs energy. My daughter ran track. She ran the 4x100 meter relay, Florida State track meet when we were pastored down in Florida when she was a senior. I sat out in that hot Florida sun for hours, many, many times for a race that lasted less than 50 seconds. Takes energy, takes effort to raise a kid when a kid is growing. And money and energy. And then comes the next stage, maturity, When everything you've dreamed about and hoped about and prayed about comes to maturity, that's the most dangerous time in a vision. There are churches all over this country that had a vision. And they grew and they got to everything they dreamed about and hoped about, and that was it. Because there's another stage, reproduction. When what you've produced in life begins to reproduce itself into other lives around it. Listen, I learned this as a pastor. People don't give themselves to needs. They give themselves to visions. They give themselves to visions. These people that came here and founded this school 75 years ago, they didn't go around talking about we need this, we need to do this. No, they had a vision of what God had led them to do. They were people of vision, and they knew where they were going. And if there's one thing we need to take with us and remember from their lives and their legacies, it's this. They were very influential people. They influenced generations. They influenced thousands of people that came through this school that touched millions of lives because they were men of vision. VIPs. What's the I for? Somebody says, well, it's for intellect. Because knowledge is power. Just know more than everybody else. No, it's not. Somebody says, well, it's intensity, passion, that spirit of conquest, that charismatic ability to sway crowds and woo people. No, that's not what I is for. I is for integrity. You know what? Beecham Vic was a person of integrity. When he would lead those crusades for Mordecai Ham and those other evangelists, he would not leave town till every single penny that they owed had been paid. These people didn't just know where they were going. They knew who they were. They were men of integrity. They were men of integrity. You want to be a person of influence? You want to learn from them? Then be a person of integrity. Know who you are. And be comfortable in who you are. Because there's nobody else like you. Because 2 Corinthians 10:13 says God has assigned an area of influence just to you. You know, those of us in ministry live in four worlds. We have a private world. No one comes into that private world. Nobody knows your anxious. Your wife doesn't know your anxious. Aren't you glad she doesn't know everything you think? Nobody lives in your private world except you and God, who knows your anxious thoughts and searches your heart. You have a private world. Then you have a personal world. They're in the dynamic interpersonal relationship of a wife and kids. And if you're fortunate in life, maybe 2 or 3 other people that really know you like you really are in that dynamic of those very close interpersonal relationships. Then there's a third world in which you live. You have a private world, you have a personal world, then you have a professional world. In ministry, some of us are known by dozens of people, scores of people, hundreds of people. Some of us even more than that in ministry. They don't know us personally necessarily, much less privately, but they know us professionally. We deal with them in the professional setting. And then there's one other world in which you live, and we call it the public world. Some people call it your public persona. That's somebody that doesn't know you professionally, much less personally or privately, and yet they've heard your name and have formed some kind of an opinion about you. So it bodes this question: where does integrity root? Where is integrity rooted in our lives? Do you know that some people are foolish enough to think it's rooted in the public world? You'd be surprised how many pastors hire public relations people to try to spin their public image so that people... It's not rooted in your public world. It's only reflected there, whether you have integrity or not. And I want to tell you, if you don't, I believe one of two things will happen to you. I've seen this so much in ministry. If you don't have integrity in ministry, it'll either be revealed publicly or God will just take his hand of anointing and blessing off of you. That's the fear of God, incidentally. Not that you have to walk around fearing that God's going to put his hand on you, but the fear that God might take his hand off of you. Blessing and anointing. Integrity is not rooted in the public world. It's only revealed there. You say, well, it's rooted in the professional world where on that anvil of personal experience we beat out those principles. No, it's not. It's only reinforced there. If we have integrity, it'll be reinforced in the way we deal with people in the professional world. You say, well, it must be rooted in that dynamic of those interpersonal. No, it's not. It's only reflected there. You want to know if I have integrity? Ask my wife, Susie. She's lived with me 55 years. Integrity is rooted in that private world, alone with God. And if it is, it'll be reflected in your inner dynamic personal relationships. It'll be reinforced in the professional setting. And it'll be revealed publicly for the glory of God in the public setting. You ever seen in these cities these beautiful modern sky? Dallas has got so many new buildings going up. Multi-story, 40, 50, 60-story buildings, these steel and glass coming out of the ground, coming up there. And you ever heard a contractor or an architect or look at a building and say, that building has structural integrity? You ever heard that phrase? You know what they mean? That building has a hidden life. You may see 40 stories of steel and glass and everything, but down underneath, hundreds of feet until it gets to the bedrock, with thousands of tons of concrete and steel that you never see. That building glistens in that Texas sun because it has a solid foundation. It has structural integrity. And that's what these folks had that founded your school, or they could have never done what they did had they not been men and women of integrity. They were VIPs, very influential people who knew where they were going, who they were. V, vision. I, integrity. P, VIP. What is P? Purpose. They were moved and motivated by dynamic purpose. They knew why they came to Springfield. They didn't just know where they were going and who they were. They knew why they came here and what they were going to be about. That's why Paul said to us through these Corinthians that God has assigned a lane for each of us to run in. This is what we can learn from these people. That there is an assigned lane just like they had that we have. That he has assigned an area of influence to us to run this race of life. You know, one of the greatest epitaphs I think could ever be said of anybody is what Paul said in his first recorded sermon at Pisidian Antioch in Acts 13 of King David. When he said in Acts 13:36, David served God's purpose in his own generation and fell asleep. What better could be said of you? That's what was said of your founders. They served God's purpose. That lane in which God assigned them to run, they served that purpose in their own generation and fell asleep. David served God's purpose. What better could be said of us? Of all the things that could be said about King David, he was a money raiser, a great motivator of people, a great leader. No, David said he served. He served. What? God's purpose. God's will for his life. God's irrevocable calling. Boule is the Greek word. It means this irrevocable calling that we have, that we can't get away from, that consumes us, the purpose and calling of God upon our lives. And it says, when? In his own generation. They did that in their own generation. Now we do it in our own generation. And he fell asleep. That's just a euphemism, Hebrew euphemism. It means he dropped dead. Pointed unto man once to die, and after that the judgment. They had an eternal purpose, just what the president was talking about a moment ago. They knew where they were going. They knew who they were. They knew why they were here. You know, I like to play golf. I play more than I should. Shot my age twice recently. But when you're 77, it's a lot easier than it used to be. My favorite hole is par 3. I'll tell you why. It only takes one good shot to make par on a par 3. You can get up there and top the ball and dribble it off the tee a few feet and then hit a second shot right up there next to the pin, tap it in, and make par. You can slice the ball off to the right into the trees and hit your next shot up there and barely get on the green with the pin 50 feet away and hit a putt 50 feet that drops in and make a par. It only takes one good shot to make par on par 3. That's not the way it is with influence. Jack Graham and I were in seminary together 50 years ago. We wrote down the other day names of all these guys we're in seminary with today. And it was shocking how many of them aren't in the race any longer. Because it takes all three. I know people who know where they were going. They had a vision, but they got out there and leading their church, and it showed up that they didn't have any integrity. They're no longer in the race. I've known others that had impeccable integrity, but they couldn't lead anything. Didn't have any vision. Didn't know where God was leading them. Didn't feel motivated by any purpose. And they're not in the race. I know people who were moved and motivated by a dynamic of purpose. They were soul winners. They got out there, but they didn't know where they were going, didn't have any integrity. It takes all three. That's what we learned from your founders. It's not enough to just know where you're going if you don't know who you are and why you're here. The greatest influencer in the history of the world we know was our Lord Jesus Christ. Vision? Talk about a visionary. He got a bunch of motley, callous-handed, quasi-literate Galilean fishermen and didn't say, go over to Tiberias and go over to Bethsaida and reach those. No, what did he say? I want you to go into the whole world and preach the gospel to every creature. Talk about a visionary. And they did it in their generation. Took the gospel to the bounds of Rome itself and shook it to its core. Integrity, he preached the world's greatest sermons and unlike all the rest of us preachers, practiced every single syllable he preached. Impeccable integrity. Purpose. Remember what he said at Sychar when the disciples brought him lunch? He said, I'm not hungry. My meat, the thing that sustains me is what? To do the will of him who sent me while there's still time. No wonder we're here 2,000 years later, 8,000 miles away, because we serve the greatest influencer who ever lived that led the way. And those founders were imitators of Christ. Let me just close. You know, when I was putting this together the other day, a verse came into my mind that I memorized back there as a teenager. I hadn't thought about it in years. And why it came into my mind, I don't know why. Why it's an obscure verse in Hosea. Why I ever memorized it, I don't know. Maybe I heard a sermon on it, I don't know. But it's Isaiah 14, verse 5. You know what it says? It's a promise from God. He said, I will be like the dew to my people. I'll be like the dew to Israel. I will be, think about that. God said, I will be like the dew to my people. You know, you go out in the yard and get the paper. We don't have papers anymore hardly, but you go out and walk in the yard and there's dew all over the grass. Where does dew come from? I want to ask you, don't answer, just think about it. Does dew fall or does dew rise? Neither. It just appears when certain conditions are right. We call it condensation. Certain barometric conditions are right, dew just shows up. God said, I want to be like that. I'll be like the dew to my people. We say, oh, God, fall on us. Oh, God, rise up and meet us. No, he'll just show up when certain conditions get right in your life. When you know where you're going. When you know who you are. When you know why you're here. You'll find that lane God has assigned to you to run the race of life. And you'll one day then hear, well done, good, faithful servant.